Now, it claims to represent the real people, to fight against the elite. It calls our current political systems corrupt. Populism is said to be growing in success around the world, with actors on both the left and the right. Donald Trump, Nicolas Maduro, Rodrigo Duterte. They've all been called populists. So what exactly is populism? Where does it come from? And is it really growing in popularity? To give us his perspective, we're joined on set by political scientist Cristobal Rovira Kaltwasser. Mr. Rovira Kaltwasser, you've written a book on it, in fact, a number of books on it, but maybe I can start with asking that question. What exactly is populism? Because, you know, political parties would all claim they represent the people.
Right. Now, this is a good question because my impression is nowadays everybody's using the concept, and I think that we need to be a bit more careful. So the way in which I define, but many colleagues, populism, it's mainly an ideology that has two characteristics. The first one is there is a distinction between the pure people and the corrupt elite. This distinction is moral. The people is good, the elite is bad. And secondly, populism means always defending popular sovereignty by all means. So if I find a politician that is talking in that sort of language, then I will see, okay, this is sort of a populist language. But as you are saying, this is only part of the story, because populism always appears attached to other ideologies, and this is why populism sometimes moves to the left or moves to the right.
Indeed, because that elite that they talk about in populism, it's not just the financial elite.
It can be very different. I mean, think about Donald Trump. I mean, he's a billionaire. And he sometimes says, okay, we have a corrupt elite, but he talks mainly about draining the swamp in Washington. So he's talking mainly about the political elite. So each populist actor is going to define the elite in different ways, and this is why populism sometimes moves into one direction or in the other one. And the same for the people. So populist politicians can define the people in ethnic terms, and this is why it moves to the right. Think about the Front National in France. Or they can define the people much more in like Podemos in Spain, saying like this is all those who are excluded, in which there is no ethnic way in which you are defining the people. It's a different way of defining that.
So talk us through some of the common characteristics then that populist leaders all use.
Well, I think it's a mistake to assume that all populist leaders are charismatic. I mean, these are two different phenomena. It's very often the case, but you also have like charismatic leaders that are non-populist. I think we need to distinguish that. Think about Nelson Mandela in Africa. He was pretty charismatic and he was anything but a populist. He didn't have like this sort of moral rhetoric, so to say. And this is sometimes that people sometimes forget and think, oh, everybody who is a charismatic leader automatically is going to be a populist. And I think we need to disentangle that.
But they do have common traits, like it will be that us versus them mentality. Yes. I believe they use even personal pronouns more. There are certain things they do.
Tend to be male very often and very macho politics. I mean, you don't have very often women that use that sort of rhetoric. There are some examples. There
are some exceptions. But when you look at populism and it's claimed to represent the majority,
right? Is
that not a good thing?
Well, the main problem is, as you are saying, the majority that populist claims is a moral majority. And this is the tricky part, because, of course, we'll say in a democratic system, the people should rule. But who are the people? So if you think about different countries, there is a lot of variations on that. The problem with populists is that they say, we, the populists, are representing the people in this moral terminology. And this is what makes the whole debate much more complicated, because if we do have a moral debate, it's very difficult to reach an agreement, because I'm going to think that you are bad, and I'm going to think that I'm the good one. So how I'm going to reach a deal with someone who is bad, and how you're going to reach a deal with someone who you think that you are bad. And this is the problem of populism, that because of this moral terminology, the possibility of reaching agreements is very difficult.
Indeed, in a way it leads to its own form of elitist systems as well, and having, you know, a minority deciding what they like for the majority. We are being told that it is on the rise across the world. Yes. A lot of people point the finger of blame to recessions and financial issues, but you say that's too simple.
No, I think this is way too simple. I mean, my best example, I mean, if you think about Western Europe, the most voted populist radical right party in Western Europe is in Switzerland, Schweizerische Volkspartei. 35% of Swiss people vote for that party. And the economic situation in Switzerland is wonderful. So if economic reasons explain the rise of populism, it's not very clear. Think about Germany, the rise of AfD, Alternative für Germany. It came also in a moment in which the economic system was doing very, very well in Germany. So I'm not saying that economic explanations do not help, but I'm only saying that these economic explanations only tell us part of the story. I think it's much more complex than that.
It's more that disconnect between voters and the people in power.
Exactly. When you have politicians, a political system that is not able to connect with what the people are thinking, then the possibility that populism might rise is much bigger. This sometimes is related to economic malfunctioning, but very often to political malfunctioning.
So what would the consequence then be of these populist leaders and populism on our democracies?
Well, the consequences, I always try to say, can be both positive and negative. I mean, there are many reasons why they can have a negative impact. This whole majority discourse might have an impact on key institutions of liberal democracy. Normally, a populist leader is going to say, I want to control those institutions. Think about Supreme Court or different kinds of tribunals, etc. But it might have also positive impacts. For example, we normally say that turnout levels have been decreasing all over the world. But when you have populist actors coming into power or trying to gain some power, what will happen is they will be able to mobilize sectors of society that normally don't participate. And it might generate also a counter-mobilization. If you are someone who don't like the populists, you will say, okay, maybe it's good that I go to the polls on that day because I want to cast my vote against those type of actors. It's not a coincidence that in the last European elections, we had for the first time increasing turnout, and I think that might be related to populist actors.
And we keep saying that populism is on the rise, but do you think it really is? Because populism is nothing new.
It's not new. I think it depends. I think in Europe, it's a relatively new phenomenon that started in the 80s and 90s. But if you think about other countries, I mean, coming from Latin America, you cannot think about Latin American history without thinking about populism. If you think about the US, it's a country in which you had a lot of populist actors in the past. What is new is that in the US we have a populist president. But if you think about the subnational level in the US, there have been a couple of different politicians that have been using that sort of rhetoric in the past. So in this sense, I think, again, in Europe, it might be a bit newer, but in many other countries of the world, it's not something very new.
And finally, how do you think other political parties can counter that populist argument?
Well, I think it's difficult because one of the main problems of mainstream political parties is that they tend to moralize the debate. And by this, I mean that they say, we are the good ones and they are the bad ones. And if mainstream parties start to do that, this is music to the ears of populism, because populism is saying there is a corrupt establishment, and if the establishment start to say that the populists are the bad ones, then you have this moralization of the political debate. And this is what mainstream political parties need to avoid. What they should try to do is to better understand why is it that many voters are in favor of that type of parties. And that might be in part because of the rhetoric, but maybe also because of the policies that they are defending, which doesn't mean that mainstream parties need to copy that sort of policies, but maybe need to rethink about their own policies to try to please certain factions of the electorate.
Here to stay, do you think populism, or the current wave, at least in Europe?
I think for Europe, it's going to make a couple of headlines in the coming years.
And of course, we're seeing Donald Trump there, and we'll see if he gets re-elected now that he is part of the establishment and the White House. We're out of time, but thanks so much for coming in and giving us a better understanding of that word and movement, populism.
Okay, thank you very much.